Hello. This is Antje from Byte Shuffle. Thank you for always watching our videos. This time, I've put together an overview of how to approach the Beans control matchup with Doomsday, along with my sideboarding strategy. There's also a link to the pile breakdown video in the description, so feel free to check it out. Here is the deck list we will be using this time. It's a bit weak, but since I have card draw, lands, and interaction, I decide to keep. Surveil's effect sends it to the graveyard. I'll use discard to check what's ahead. I took out Tameo Inquisitive Student. The opponent cast Ponder and chose not to shuffle. I'm digging for Doomsday. Surveil's effect leaves it on top of the library. I'm digging for Doomsday. Surveil's effect leaves it on top of the library. I'm digging for Doomsday. Didn't find it, so I shuffle. Until I draw some interaction, I don't really have anything else to do, so I put Tameo, Inquisitive Student and Murktide Regent onto the battlefield. I'm digging for a disruption spell. I put Wasteland on top, then a fetch land. With Philia Exuberant Shepherd on the battlefield, I don't think this will do much, but since it at least slows down my opponent's clock a bit, I go ahead and put Murktide Regent into play. And this is where the adventure comes to an end. Before sideboarding, I'd like to review the list we used. First, the conclusion. I will explain it step by step. First, I'd like to briefly go over how the Beans control deck operates. Broadly speaking, the deck operates in two main ways. The first is to get up the Beanstalk onto the battlefield, and then cast 5 mana or more spells like Quantum Riddler, or deploy their finisher, Murktide Regent. This is the first game plan, controlling the game by casting Force of Will on the opponent's threats while generating card advantage along the way. The second plan is to put Philia Exuberant Shepherd onto the battlefield, and then deploy up the Beanstalk or Quantum Riddler. After that, they exile those cards with Philia's ability and then return them to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step, generating card advantage in the process. Another line is to use Philia's ability to exile permanents like Tameo or Murktide Regent on the opponent's battlefield, by exiling them with Philia's effect, and then countering the end step return trigger with Consign to Memory, which lets Philia function as pseudo-removal. This is the second game plan. With that out of the way, let's get into the main topic. These are the cards in Beans control that have an impact on Doomsday. First, there are counterspells like Force of Will and Force of Negation, as well as spells like Consign to Memory and Dress Down, that can shut off Thassa's Oracle's triggered ability. To fight back against these, we add Duress. In exchange, I cut Lotus Petal. That's because the game tends to slow down into an exchange of interaction from both sides, which lowers the value of cards that are purely there to increase speed. Next, let's talk about Tameo Inquisitive Student. To answer this, I bring in Fatal Push and the Long Goodbye. This time, since the only targets for removal are Philia and Tameo, I decided to add just one copy of each. If this were something like UW Control that also runs Stoneforge Mystic, I think it would be better to bring the removal count up to 3. In exchange, I cut Murktide Regent. That's because the opponent's removal is Swords to Plowshares, which makes Murktide Regent easy to deal with. I'll keep this hand since it looks like I can go all in on the first turn. I'm going all in. From here, I'll increase the mana needed for the combo. The first thing you really need to pay attention to is how many copies of Consign to Memory and Dress Down your opponent is currently holding. The tricky part is deciding how many discard spells to include in the pile. If you make the pile too slow, your opponent's Velia Exuberant Shepherd Clock can end up being fast enough to kill you. Next, you also need to account for how many copies of Wasteland your opponent is likely to have. For this scenario, I assumed my opponent had at most one Wasteland, and a hand containing 2 or more copies of Consign to Memory and/or Dress Down. Based on that, I built the pile to include 1 dual land and 3 discard spells, with the plan being to fire off Thassa's Oracle after using 2 of the discard spells. I built the pile in the following order: a dual land Duress Thassa's Oracle Thoughtseize. Surveil's effect sends it to the graveyard. I'll use discard to check what's ahead. I use Brainstorm as the pile opener. I put Orcish Bowmasters back on top, followed by Cavern of Souls. I cast a discard spell to see what sideboard cards my opponent might be holding. I'll choose Wizard and win the game with Thassa's Oracle. For Game 3, I cut Lion's Eye Diamond and brought in Consign to Memory. Since I'm on the draw this time, I felt it was better to add more defensive cards rather than trying to win immediately on the turn I combo off. It's a bit weak, but it didn't feel bad enough to mulligan, so I kept. Surveil's effect sends it to the graveyard. I start applying pressure with Tamiyo. I hold up Orcish Bowmasters. I'll counter it with Daze. I already have plenty of lands in hand, so I cast Dark Ritual, which I no longer need. I respond with Orcish Bowmasters. I draw a card from the clue. I use a discard spell to strip my opponent's removal. I debated whether I needed to play around Leyline Binding here, but since it felt like I could keep applying pressure and win, I went looking for Doomsday. In hindsight, I think it would have been better to hold up Consign to Memory instead. Surveil's effect leaves it on top of the library. I'll use discard to check what's ahead. I took out Leyline Binding. I'm digging for Doomsday. Surveil's effect leaves it on top of the library. I transform Tamiyo. Tamiyo's ability is 2. My opponent shuffled off a Ponder. I'll counter it with Consign to Memory. Thank you for watching up to this point. I apologize for the many play mistakes. I hope to improve at MTG together with everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving it a thumbs up. See you next time. This is Antya.